mentioned in the Bible, and we're not going to get bogged down in any particular point, but I just want to bring some practical application to some things and truths that we find in our text. So I'll go to Matthew chapter number 7. We'll read verse number 13, then we will flip over to Luke chapter 10, verse number 30 through 37, and we'll look at the first road, which is the road to Jericho. Now in Matthew chapter number 7, verse number 13, the Bible declares, "Enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be that go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way that leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it." In our text, when you consider the word way, it literally means a highway, a road, or a route. And when we consider the matter, the Bible has a lot to say about different paths in the Bible concerning different means of transportation, or routes for transportation, I should say. And so we've been looking at roads in the Bible. And the first road that we've looked at, and we just barely cracked the door open of it, is in the book of Luke chapter number 10. And we'll read just a few verses of this to set the context for today and make just a couple of quick brief applications. Again, we're not going to get into any extensive study or anything on any particular point, but I just want to bring some practical thoughts from the text. Notice, if you would please, in Luke's Gospel chapter number 10, and we'll begin reading in verse number 30. "And Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment, and wounded him, and departed, and leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him, and passed by on the other side." I'm going to stop there just for the sake of time this morning, but if we were to take and read it in its entirety down through verse number 37, we'll find several significant truths concerning this path, or this way, this road in the Bible. Again, Jericho was a flourishing town and city during this time, and we find that there were a lot of people, merchants, religious people, and it was a major route. And so we find that all types of people would travel this road. But in this road, we find about four things I want to bring out to our attention in our text and to look at it. Number one, we find that it was a risky road. In verse number 30, the Bible says again, "This man, as he traveled from Jerusalem down to Jericho, he fell among thieves." And this was a very treacherous path. It was a path that often people would be robbed and looted, and it was a very dangerous trek where people would travel between those 2 points, point A to point B. And so we find in verse number 30 that it was a risky road. I'm sort of, instead of going into all the historical background of it, in this approximately 15 and a half mile stretch between Jericho and Jerusalem, when you consider the matter and you study it historically, it was a very risky path. It was a very risky road for travelers to go through. And can I just say to you that there are paths in life that we choose, even right paths, that are risky in our livelihood or in our lives. There's a lot of people, let me just put it this way, I'm struggling to find the words to get exactly what I want to say in just a very short time this morning, but can I put it this way? There's a lot of Christians, a lot of preachers, a lot of missionaries, a lot of God's people that are stagnated this morning. They cannot get from point A to point B because they're not willing to take any risk. They stop and I believe as leaders, I believe as Christians, we ought to evaluate everything in our life. I don't think we ought to do anything flippantly. Right. I think we're commanded to walk circumspectly. Yeah. And to walk circumspectly means that we have to be very cautious about every step, every path, every direction that we walk in. The Bible says, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." And so God, through that passage alone, is telling us that there are dangers ahead of us, or at least that we need to know where we're getting ready to put our foot down in the path in which we're going. And so there are risks, but there are some people that take the risk, they evaluate it, and there's so much risk on the path of the journey, they become frightful or fearful or faithless, and they're unwilling to move and step out by faith because of the risk. Can I say something to you? Everything we do in life has a risk. Yeah. Someone says, "Well, I know that my retirement is secure because I've got this much money in the bank, and this much in the stocks and savings, and this much in an IRA account, and all the rest of it." Really? Yeah. You really think you're that secure? with the administration we have and the direction we're going with this nation and the current situation with the inflation and the decisions that have been made, and with China coming on rapidly as a world power and world leader, they're having huge influence in Africa. They have taken over a lot of influence in Asia. They're also influencing Brazil and other portions of the world, and they're getting their foot in the door to take over the mineral and resources in these nations to gain economic power. Our nation's government is pushing toward the green agenda and battery-powered vehicles and so forth, and China owns a majority of everything that is used to produce the batteries and so forth. So we're leaning upon them. So I'm just simply saying, you shouldn't have got me involved in politics this morning by looking at me the way you did. I'm just simply saying this: everything we do in life has a risk to it. Yes. But that should not cause us to stop and hesitate. We should evaluate and then move forward and progress on the journey and the path that God leads. This ministry, Rock of Ages Ministries, I can promise you, I've only been a missionary 36, soon to be 37 years with this ministry, but we've been in existence for 45 years. And I can tell you that out of the 8 years that I was not here, and then some of the times that I have been here, I've heard war stories from times past. Yes. Now somebody say, man, that's just honest to God's truth. Yes. Any ministry, and I'm not advocating we ought to have trouble and we go looking for it. Man, this wonderful woman's a few days and full of trouble. But there is not a ministry today that is worth a grain of salt that hasn't been tested and tried in every avenue and area that you can imagine. There's no church. There's no mission organization. There's no ministry on the foreign field. It may be tested through hardships of health. It may be tested through hardships of finances. It may be tested through hardships of internal bickering and fighting and division, or external assault on the ministry. But you will not exist any time, for any length of time in the day and age we live, without somewhere facing a risk and having to make a very critical decision in the ministry. And this was a risky road. There was risk involved. They knew, this man knew before he made the trek, that it was a risky road. It had a bad reputation. If you travel on the Jericho road, you knew that there was a certain risk that you were going to take. It's kind of like going to New York City or Chicago and you want to get in the streets or whatever at night. That'd be a very dumb decision, but there is a risk involved, okay? Yeah. And so it was a risky road. Secondly, if you look with me very quickly, and I just want to open the door to this one, and we'll pick up maybe tomorrow. Again, I don't want to get bogged down on this particular text. There are several things we'll look at. But notice in verse number 31 and verse number 32, and by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. In verse number 32, and likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. Now, I'm not going to get into all the ramifications. We've all heard messages on, the Jericho Road and the Good Samaritan, so I'm not going to be redundant on some of these things. We'll look at it from just a little bit of a different perspective. It was not only a risky road, it was a religious road. Religious people would travel between Jerusalem and also through Jericho. And so it was not only a risky road, it was a religious road. There were religious people that were passing through this on a regular basis. But notice the type of religion these people had. And I know we've all heard this preached in messages on the Good Samaritan, but notice the type of religion that was represented on these two that are here in the scriptures, the priest and the Levite. Notice their type of religion didn't want to get their hands involved, didn't want to get their feet dirty, didn't want to get their hands dirty. They came, they looked, and they passed by on the other side. I believe one of the reasons that we are in the condition we're in today, and when I say condition we're in, I'm not talking about just political, although I do believe that it plays a big impact on that. I believe one of the reasons our nation's in the mess it's in the fact that our churches are not represented and preachers are disdained and scorned. They used to be disdained and scorned anyway. All through time there's been disdain and scorn. Alexander the coppersmith did Paul much harm. There's others in the scriptures. Yep. Demas had forsaken him, having loved the present world. And so the Bible is replete with scriptures where people, remember Elisha, they came out and made fun of his bald head. And so from the Old Testament to the New Testament, God's men, God's work, God's church has face persecution and ridicule. But it's a lot of times not from the world, but from the religious crowd. Yeah. And one of the reasons I believe that we have lost our influence with the world is because there's too much religion, like we find in the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. The priest and the Levite that saw the condition but passed by on the other side. They didn't want to get involved. And that's exactly why I believe we are where we are today, because we've been traveling, if I could put it this way symbolically, we've been traveling down the Jericho road. We've been unwilling to take a risk. We are traveling down a religious road rather than a godly road, a godly path. And here we find this man, these two men, the Levite and the priest. They walked by, they looked over and beheld the situation. They knew the circumstances, but they passed by on the other side and didn't lift a finger to get involved. They didn't want to be associated with. They didn't want to get their hands dirty with it. They just passed by on the other side to appease themselves, and likely because of the personal risk involved. Yeah. You know, the truth of the matter is, we live in a day and age where we need to be willing to take some risks, to stand up for what's right. And I know of preachers that have said over the years, I remember one specific preacher said, you know, I would do this, but there's too much risk involved. And I thought to myself, if you're not willing to take a risk, you'll never know what the outcome could have been. Yeah. I'd rather attempt something great for God and be a failure or fail in that attempt than to sit back and be known as well, let me just go ahead and say it, a good for nothing. Yes. Because if you don't do anything for God, you're good for nothing. Yeah. Because I remember years ago, I say years ago, it might have been upwards of a year ago, I walked in and I was kind of like, you know, running in. I was changing, putting my suit clothes on, and I was doing meetings. I'd change back into my work clothes and go up and work on the chapel or other areas in the property and come back in, put my suit on, and do other things. I was back and forth constantly, and then there were some things broke down in the mail room that I was working on and different things with our mail opener. And Miss Darlene asked me one day, she said, is there anything you can't do or don't do? I said, I can't do nothing. So you can take that with a grain of salt, but I can't do nothing. I don't want to just sit on the wayside and do nothing. Might be good for nothing, but I don't want it to be good for nothing as in I don't do anything. I want it to be as in good for nothing as I do a little bit of everything, but maybe not perfect at anything. So Peggy's not here, so she should be shouting amen, and we'd have to cut the camera off this morning. So let's close right there if I could, please. And let's have a verse, and then we'll get about our business for the day. But the Jericho road, one of the first paths that we see in the New Testament, it was a risky road, and it was a religious road. All right, give us a course, Brother Robert.
Oh, it's wonderful to be a Christian. Oh, it's wonderful to be God's child. Oh, it's wonderful to have his sins forgiven. Oh, it's wonderful to be redeemed, justified, forever reconciled.
God bless you. Let's get about our responsibilities.